My name is Shelby Pratt. I am 29 years old. My older sister was standing at the head of my parents' dining table in Birmingham, Alabama, pointing a serving fork at me like it was a verdict, and she said clear enough for every relative to hear, "You're the most disappointing one in this family. If you're not going to help, get out of my engagement dinner." She didn't stutter, she didn't lower her voice, and she didn't look away. My mom stared down at her plate. My dad swirled his sweet tea, and my Aunt Nina watched me like she was waiting to see if I'd make a scene that would ruin Tara's big night. I didn't yell back. I didn't plead my case. I just felt every eye at that table on me, including Tara's fiancé Dylan, who couldn't even look in my direction. Before I walk you through how that one dinner spiraled into police reports, wrecked credit, and my sister losing the future everyone thought she deserved, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell me in the comments if you've ever had a family dinner explode over money the way mine did. I pushed my chair back, feeling the legs scrape against my parents' tile, and I remember how loud that sound felt in the silence that followed Tara's words. Nobody said, "Shelby, sit down." Nobody said, "That was too far." My mom just muttered something about not doing this tonight, but it wasn't directed at Tara, it was directed at me, like I was the disruption. I grabbed my purse from the back of the chair, walked past the kitchen where the pans of baked chicken and macaroni were still steaming, and stepped out into the humid Alabama night. The porch light followed me halfway down the driveway, and when I pulled out in my old sedan, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror and realized that in their eyes, I only existed when they needed something from me. 2 weeks went by after that night. No calls I answered, no texts I replied to, no group chat messages I even opened. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to smooth things over, and the silence felt almost unreal. Then my dad's name flashed across my screen one afternoon, while I was debugging code in my tiny downtown apartment. I stared at it long enough for the call to almost go to voicemail, then I answered. His voice wasn't calm or apologetic. It was strained and angry. "Shelby, what are you doing? Why didn't you make the payment on the Tahoe?" I actually laughed at first because it sounded so absurd. "What Tahoe?" I asked. He sounded offended, like I was playing dumb. "The SUV you're leasing for Tara to get to her clinical sites. They called the house. They said they're 30 days past due and they can't reach you." My pulse started pounding in my ears. I told him I had never leased any SUV for anyone. He kept talking over me, saying they had my name, my social security number, my address, and that if I didn't get it straightened out, they could repossess it and trash my credit. They had apparently juggled the first few payments on their own, but once I stopped being available as backup, the whole arrangement started collapsing. And that was the moment I knew the dinner wasn't the real betrayal. It was just the last time they bothered to say things to my face. Growing up on the outskirts of Birmingham meant Friday night football games, church potlucks, and neighborhoods where everybody knew the Pratt family by which daughter they were talking about. Tara was that girl with the perfect grades and the big smile, the one who sang solos in the church choir and captained the soccer team. I was the little one who's good with computers, usually said with a shrug like it was cute, but not something you brought up in conversation with pride. Our house ran on an unspoken rule book, and the first rule was that everything needed to look good for Tara. She was older by 3 years, and somehow that translated into her choices being family choices, her schedule being the household schedule, her mood being the weather inside the walls. My Aunt Nina, my mom's older sister, played into it hard, always bragging about Tara at family barbecues, telling anyone who would listen that Tara was going to put our family on the map. When it came to me, she'd say things like, "Shelby's quiet, but she's helpful," which sounded less like a compliment and more like a job description. By the time we hit high school, our roles were locked in. Tara was on track to go into physical therapy, and later she shifted toward a physician assistant program, something that sounded respectable and easy to brag about. My parents told anyone who would stand still long enough that Tara was going to be in medicine, like the details didn't matter, as long as it sounded impressive. I spent my time in the computer lab teaching myself basic coding, messing with websites, and repairing old laptops for teachers who didn't want to toss them. Nobody told me it was useless, but nobody asked many questions either. When Tara started touring colleges, the whole family drove to campuses in Georgia and Tennessee, while I stayed home with the dog and a frozen pizza. My mom would come back with brochures and talk about scholarships and dorm life. When I mentioned online courses and tech boot camps, she smiled politely and asked if I'd thought about getting a real job at one of the local offices instead. After community college and a pile of online certifications, I landed my first remote gig doing tech support and small development tasks for a healthcare software company. It didn't impress my parents, but money started showing up in my account on a regular basis, and that impressed me. I saved what I could while still living at home, working odd hours from my bedroom desk, headphones on, while Tara's social life spilled down the hallway. When Tara's old Honda finally died, my parents held a family meeting at the kitchen table. I thought it was going to be about how she needed to get a part-time job to help pay for a replacement. Instead, it was about how we all needed to pull together to keep Tara on track. That meant my parents would co-sign on a cheaper used car, and I would help with the initial costs since I was good with money. I wrote a check for the down payment without much argument because the idea of being the one who stood between Tara and her bright future made me feel like I was asking for trouble. When I finally moved into my own one-bedroom apartment closer to downtown Birmingham, it felt like someone had quietly handed me the volume knob on my life. The traffic outside my window was louder, but the expectations were softer. I set up a decent desk, upgraded my monitor, and took on more work from my main client, plus two smaller startups. I was handling integration projects, data cleanup, and user support tickets, all from my living room. My parents still didn't really get it. Whenever my mom described my job to someone, she'd say Shelby does computer things from home, like I was entering sweepstakes instead of paying my rent. But they understood one thing clearly: money kept showing up when I needed it to. And once they realized that, the phone calls shifted. At first, it was small stuff: my mom's tire blew out on the interstate, the power bill was a little higher than expected, Tara's campus parking fee was due. Every time the caller ID would pop up, there'd be a long sigh on the other end, and somehow the solution would end up coming from my debit card. The pattern started small enough that it didn't seem worth questioning. Tara needed a new set of scrubs for clinical labs, and my parents were stretched thin, so I transferred the money. Tara needed to retake a test that required an extra prep course, and the registration deadline was that day, so I paid for it. When rent on Tara's off-campus apartment ran short one month, my dad called and said, "We'll pay you back when taxes come in," which never actually happened, but at the time, I shrugged it off. Aunt Nina loved to make comments at family get-togethers about how some people are just more stable, and they help keep everything afloat, and somehow everyone's eyes would flick toward me when she said it. No one used the word "oh," but the feeling of obligation was there, woven into the way my family talked about Tara's path, like my income existed in the background to smooth any rough edges that might slow her down. Tara started dating Dylan during the second year of her program, and he fit seamlessly into the narrative my family had built around her. He was charming, worked in medical sales, wore nice shoes to Sunday lunch, and told my dad he admired how much the family supported Tara's ambitions. When they got engaged, the congratulations barely died down before the logistics started. Wedding venues, catering deposits, dresses, travel for his family from out of state. I told myself I'd stay out of it, that this was one thing I wasn't going to bankroll. But then my mom called crying one evening, saying the venue they loved required a non-refundable deposit by the end of the week, and they were a little short. "We'll pay you back once the tax refund hits," she said again, like the first time hadn't disappeared into the air. Against my better judgment, I wired the money, telling myself it was a one-time thing. Meanwhile, at work, I was paired up more often with a developer named Ryan Cho, who became one of the first people outside my family to know anything real about my life. Ryan wasn't dramatic or overly emotional, but he had boundaries that showed up in small ways. He logged off when he said he would log off. He didn't answer work messages during dinner. When his parents hinted that he should help his cousin with tuition, he said no without turning it into a crisis. We ended up on late-night calls a lot, working through tricky code and somewhere between bug reports and database schemas. I admitted that my family treated my bank account like a safety net. Ryan suggested I track every transfer and extra expense for a few months, not to punish anyone, but so I could see the pattern without emotion clouding it. I opened a spreadsheet and started logging every time I paid a bill that wasn't mine, every time I transferred money just this once. After a year of entries, I realized I had spent well over $30,000 on Tara and my parents since I'd moved out. That number sat in my chest like a brick, but instead of changing anything immediately, I did what I'd always done. I told myself I was being dramatic and kept going. The night of Tara and Dylan's combined engagement, and she's almost done with her program. Dinner landed on a sticky Saturday in late summer. My parents' house was packed in a way I hadn't seen since we were kids. Cousins, church friends, coworkers of my dad's, and Aunt Nina stationed near the kitchen like a general overseeing a battlefield of casseroles. Tara floated around the room in a white sundress, accepting hugs and compliments like she was already at the altar. Dylan followed close behind, refilling drinks and cracking jokes about married life. I showed up with a leather portfolio and a high-quality planner I'd ordered for her clinical year, wrapped neatly with a ribbon. It wasn't flashy, but it was practical, and it had cost more than I admitted. My mom greeted me with a distracted kiss on the cheek and put the gift on a side table where it stayed unopened while people handed Tara envelopes and monogrammed wine glasses. I stayed near the wall, filling my own plate, pretending I was fine with being an extra in a movie about my sister's life. Halfway through dinner, someone at the far end of the table, one of Dylan's friends, I think, made a joke about how many miles Tara was going to put on her car, driving to clinical sites all over the region. My dad chuckled and said, "Well, she won't be in that old Honda much longer," and my ears pricked up. Aunt Nina leaned forward, eyes bright. "Once they get the new SUV sorted, she'll be riding in style," she said. Tara laughed and added, "That's what happens when your family believes in you." Then she glanced straight at me and said in a tone that sounded like a joke, but wasn't, "Some people in this house have good credit and tech jobs, so they can help the rest of us not drown in debt, right?" A few people laughed. Someone said, "Must be nice to be in computers." My face went hot. I put my fork down and said as evenly as I could that I wasn't co-signing anything and that I was done paying for things that weren't mine. The clink of silverware stopped. My mom hissed my name like I had sworn in church, and Aunt Nina murmured that it was tacky to talk about money at the table. Tara's expression hardened in a way I had never seen. She pushed her chair back, stood up so she was half a head above me, even across the table, and pointed that serving fork right at my face. "You know what, Shelby," she said, voice sharp and steady. "You act like a martyr every time we ask for help, but you'd be nothing without this family. You're the most disappointing one here, and if you can't be happy for me, then get out." Dylan stared at his plate. My dad cleared his throat but said nothing. My mom mumbled, "Tara, maybe sit down," but there was no real force behind it. Aunt Nina gave me a tight, disapproving look, like I had just proven every negative thing she ever thought about me. I sat there for a few seconds, my cheeks burning, wondering if anyone would say, "That isn't fair," or "She's helped a lot," but no one did. So I stood up my chair, scraping back again, and I walked out without touching the food on my plate. In the car, hands shaking on the steering wheel, I realized that in their minds, my value started and ended with what I could pay for. Over the next 2 weeks, I stuck to my decision in a way that surprised even me. I muted the family group chat, let my mom's texts stack up without reading them, and ignored my dad's Sunday call. Tara sent one message that just said, "You really embarrassed me," which I swiped away without responding. I threw myself into work instead, taking on an extra project from Ryan's team and spending late nights writing clean code instead of rehearsing imaginary arguments. Without the constant buzz of family crises, my apartment felt strangely quiet, but it wasn't empty in a lonely way. It felt like walking around a room after finally turning off a loud humming appliance you didn't realize had been bothering you. I told myself that if they were really in trouble, they'd manage like other adults do. No more emergency transfers, no more rushed payments on bills I never saw. I thought the worst fallout from that dinner was hurt feelings and awkward holidays. I hadn't even begun to imagine contracts with my name on them that I had never seen. So when my dad called about the Tahoe, his panic didn't fully land at first. I kept asking him to slow down to explain what paperwork he was talking about, and he kept snapping back that I knew exactly what he meant. They said your name is on the lease, he repeated. They mailed everything to your apartment and you're just ignoring it, and now it's going to hit your credit. I asked him when this lease was supposedly signed. He said a few months ago, around the time Tara started a new rotation farther from campus. I was certain I hadn't signed anything then. I asked who was at the dealership. He hesitated half a second too long, then said my mom and Tara had gone together to talk numbers. My stomach dropped. I asked him point blank if Tara had used my information. He said something about we're all family and, she needs reliable transportation, as if that answered the question. When I told him I had never authorized anyone to sign my name on anything, he got quiet, then said, "Well, what's done is done. We just need you to make it right." I hung up with my hand shaking. The first thing I did after that call was pull my credit report. There it was in black and white, an auto lease opened in my name with a financing company I had never dealt with, a balance that made my chest tight, and a 30-day delinquency flag. The address was my apartment's, but the phone number listed was my parents' landline. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the details. The dealership address was in a suburb not far from my parents' house, but I had never stepped foot there. Anger bubbled up, but underneath it was something heavier, the realization that all the little boundaries I'd failed to set had convinced them this was just another step they could take for Tara's sake. Instead of calling them back and screaming, I sat at my desk and opened that spreadsheet Ryan had encouraged me to start. I looked at the year's worth of transfers, the running total, and then at my credit report again. For the first time, I considered that this might not be a misunderstanding I could fix with one more payment, but something I needed to treat like a crime. A few days later, a thick envelope from the financing company showed up in my mailbox, stamped with an urgent notice. They were following up on missed payments and attempts to contact the lessee. Inside, there was a copy of the lease agreement, my name typed cleanly across the top, and a digital signature on the last page that vaguely resembled mine, but not enough to fool anyone who knew me. They had printed out a scanned image of my driver's license, too, the one I'd renewed a couple of years earlier. My head spun as I realized how easily Tara could have gotten it. My parents kept photocopies of important documents in an old accordion folder in the hall closet, a folder I'd seen my mom rifle through 100 times. The more I read, the clearer it became that someone had sat in that dealership and signed my name on a tablet, clicked boxes, confirming they were me, and driven off in a brand new SUV while I was probably at home answering support tickets. That knowledge hurt more than any insult Tara had thrown at me at the dinner table. I made an appointment with a local attorney whose name a coworker had recommended when I told them in a shaky voice that I thought my own family had committed identity theft. Sitting in that small office with framed diplomas on the wall, I laid out everything: the dinner, the years of financial help, the call from my dad, the lease contract, the forged signature. The attorney listened quietly, asked a few clarifying questions, then said something that shifted the ground under my feet. "Shelby, this isn't a family disagreement. This is fraud, and your credit and future are on the line." He walked me through the steps: filing a police report, filling out an identity theft affidavit, sending disputing letters to the financing company and the credit bureaus requesting all supporting documentation from the dealership. He explained that if we could show I didn't authorize the lease, they would have to investigate and potentially reassign liability. The part that made my stomach twist was when he said calmly that the trail was likely going to lead straight back to my sister and my parents. We filed the police report first. I sat in a chair at the station, hands folded, while an officer typed up my statement and asked me to confirm that yes, the people I was naming were my immediate family. I felt like I was watching someone else talk, but every word coming out of my mouth was mine. The dealership, once contacted by my attorney, produced the original digital application complete with IP addresses from the device used to submit it and a date and timestamp that matched a Saturday when my calendar showed I'd been on a video call with Ryan for work. Security footage from the dealership showed Tara sitting at a sales desk, my dad beside her, my mom standing a few steps back, flipping through her purse. The salesman's notes mentioned that Shelby couldn't be present but had already agreed and that they were using her information with her blessing. No such agreement existed anywhere but in their heads. When the police followed up, my parents tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, saying they assumed I would be fine with it because Shelby always helps. The financing company eventually froze the account during the investigation, and Tara kept driving the SUV around Birmingham like it was any other car, at least for a while. When the reality of the situation finally crashed into their carefully constructed narrative, it did it hard. The district attorney's office decided to move forward with charges against Tara since she was the one physically present and the one who signed my name. My parents weren't charged, but their cooperation with the dealership made them impossible to paint as innocent bystanders. Tara ended up taking a plea deal for a felony fraud charge, which meant probation, restitution payments, and most devastating for her, a report to the board that oversaw licensing in her field. The physician assistant program she was in couldn't ignore it. She was pulled from her clinical rotations, and by the end of the semester, she was informed she wouldn't be allowed to sit for licensure with that conviction on her record. Dylan, who had stood in silence while she humiliated me at dinner, quietly called off the engagement once he realized his future wife had forged her sister's identity for a car. While all of that was unfolding, my attorney and I pushed to have the lease fully removed from my credit history. The financing company, facing the evidence that I hadn't signed anything and had reported the fraud, promptly, eventually agreed to close the account and stop reporting the delinquency under my name. The SUV was repossessed from my parents' driveway one early morning while neighbors watched from behind blinds. My dad had to refinance their house to cover some of the costs that couldn't be rolled into Tara's restitution, and the retirement cushion he'd bragged about in the past evaporated. Aunt Nina, who once held court at family gatherings talking about Tara's bright future, now fielded whispers at church potlucks about how her niece had been charged with stealing from her own sister. My mom sent me emails in long, frantic paragraphs about how the family was falling apart, insisting that I could fix it by telling the judge it was all a misunderstanding. I let my attorney answer those messages with a firm statement: all communication about the case needed to go through him. Once the legal dust settled and my credit reports were finally clean again, I had to figure out what my life looked like without the background noise of my family's constant emergencies. The answer was quieter and better. I kept my job, took on some higher-level projects, and eventually negotiated a raise that reflected the responsibility I'd been carrying for years. Ryan remained a steady presence, not as a savior, but as someone who reminded me I was allowed to draw lines and keep them. I started going to therapy not to find a way to forgive my family, but to understand why I had spent so long believing I owed them everything. My therapist helped me see that every small yes I'd given them had trained them to expect bigger ones until the idea of forging my name for a car didn't feel outrageous to them, just like the next step. I moved to a slightly bigger apartment with a real office corner, bought myself a modest used car in my own name, and began building an emergency fund that existed only for me. My family didn't stop trying to pull me back in. There were letters from my mom, some angry, some pleading, saying things like families make mistakes, and you're sending your own sister to ruin. Tara never apologized directly. The closest she came was a short message relayed through my mom, where she said she wished it hadn't gone this far, which sounded more like regret about consequences than about what she'd done. Aunt Nina sent a card once with a Bible verse underlined and a note about forgiveness in the margins, as if I were the one who needed to repent. I didn't respond to any of it. I didn't go to court to watch Tara's hearings. I didn't show up at family gatherings when they tried to schedule neutral events at restaurants. The only communication I allowed was the formal kind handled by my attorney, and once the case was closed and the financial mess cleaned up, even that ended. I blocked the last numbers that still slipped through and let the silence settle in for good. People like to ask if I ever think about reconciling, like, there's some moral obligation to let people back into your life just because you share DNA. The honest answer is that I think about my family a lot, but not in the way they'd hope. I think about that dinner table in Birmingham, about Tara standing over me with a serving fork calling me a disappointment because I wouldn't finance her life anymore. I think about my dad's voice on the phone, more worried about a missed car payment than about the fact that his daughter's identity had been stolen. I think about my mom looking away while lines were crossed over and over again. And I think about how peaceful my apartment feels now that my phone only rings for work friends and the people I've chosen. I don't forgive them. I don't wish them well or ill. I simply don't consider them my responsibility anymore. I won't attend their weddings. I won't show up at their hospital beds, and when the time comes, I won't be at their funerals. That might sound harsh, but it's the only way I know to keep my life from being consumed again. The biggest lesson I took from all of this is that love without boundaries is just a slow kind of self-destruction. My family taught me that if I didn't constantly give, I wasn't loyal, and when I finally refused, they proved that their loyalty to me was conditional on what I could provide. They didn't just ask for help, they expected my future to be collateral for my sisters. In the end, their choices cost them far more than anything they ever took from me. Tara lost the career she thought was guaranteed. My parents lost financial stability and the daughter they thought would always bail them out. Aunt Nina lost the shiny narrative she loved to tell. I lost the illusion that they would ever see me as anything other than a resource. If you're listening to this and you feel that tug of recognition, if your worth in your family seems tied to what you can give, hear me clearly, you are allowed to step away. You are allowed to say no to protect your credit, your peace, and your future. Thank you for hearing my story. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And don't forget to subscribe if you want more honest family stories like this.